Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter is with me again today. Hunter, thanks for being here.
Autumn, it's great to be back talking about this book, The Priests of History, or in your case, the Priestess of History.
I think it's an inclusive term.
Oh, okay. It's a gender-inclusive term.
I think so.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
As it's used here. Yeah. Sort of like man in the Bible can sometimes just mean human, you know?
That's right, man.
Yeah, exactly. And the author of this book that we're discussing is Sarah Irving Stonebreaker. This is our second discussion about this book, and we discovered in the first episode that her name is really long. It's hard to say repeatedly.
Yes.
Yes.
We just call her Stonebreaker for short.
That's right. I think you also gave our listeners an explanation as to why that might be her name, and then explained that it is spelled Stonebraker. So, I think that's a pretty good summary. Everyone is probably pretty much up to speed.
It's been a week since we had that conversation, so I can't remember what reason I came up with, but I'm sure it was compelling.
I'm sure it was. We can listen back and see if it holds this week. It also is a Thursday afternoon. And as our listeners might remember, we often make the quip that Thursday afternoons are not our best time in terms of you and I just having responses at the ready, and our brains are feeling a little sluggish. And you usually attribute that to me. You usually say...
you just said sluggish. So
I did.
Example number one. You usually attribute
that to me, but I'd like everyone to know that you actually said that a moment ago. Also...
I did.
Also, to just really let everyone know our situation today, Jesse, our technical producer, who does our fact-checking and keeps us on track, isn't with us today.
He's not. And it's the first day of the NCAA basketball tournament, so that's what Jesse is doing. He's at home watching basketball games. So thanks for leaving us hung out to dry, Jesse. But
March Madness took priority. It's good to know your priorities.
That's right. It is.
Yeah, it is. All right. Well, we are discussing this book, Priests of History, and... contrary to what I said, I think nothing of what we have just shared brought our listeners up to speed. So maybe we should do a short recap of our first episode and the summary of the book.
Her thesis is that modern Westerners live in what she calls an ahistoric age. And ahistoric means not that we're anti-history, that we hate history, but that we don't have much connection to history, or we don't think of ourselves as having much connection to history. And so we tend to think of like, this is our moment, we get to make the world what we want to make it. And we tend to not be aware of how we have been impacted by the generations who have come before us, or if we do have a view of history, it's just a negative view. Like, history is oppressive and lots of oppression took place in history, and we need to throw off or acknowledge and throw off that oppression so we modern people can move into the light of day. And this is actually an attitude that began, I think, with the Enlightenment, but she marks 2010 forward as a real transition to this ahistoric age. I might call it an acceleration of trends that have been prevalent in our culture for 200-300 years. But why does she call 2010 a transition to this ahistoric age?
Well, I think because of she identifies a number of factors that she uses to describe the ahistoric age and to point to as characteristics of our ahistoric age. And so 2010 is the year that she selects because those various characteristics are really observable in Western society from that point on. But I think, to your point, the term an acceleration of is appropriate in that we could probably observe them most clearly starting in 2010, as she's pointing to that date. And it probably has something to do with the age of the internet and social media and how that has accelerated and exacerbated many of these trends.
I think that's a good summary. And in parts 1 and 2 of this book, she talks about what happened that caused this ahistoric age And then she makes the case in part two of why we need to, as Christians especially, why we need to be what she calls priest of history. And this image of priests are people who tend to something on behalf of a whole population. In fact, I was just texting back and forth with a friend of mine because we had both been reading through Leviticus through the Bible in a year. In Leviticus is where you tend to, lose through the Bible in the year plan. But it would actually help to text it back and forth with him because we were saying, isn't it fascinating that God basically created this tribe, a 12th of the nation of Israel? There was a tribe of people who were butchers. They were basically constantly butchering animals and inspecting skin diseases and tending to the cultic life, the worship and the tabernacle in their case, the sacrifices of the people, and the priests were set apart among the nation to tend to this, and so when she's offering this image of we are priest of history, she's saying as Christians, one of our roles in the modern world should be that we are tending to and we are cultivating and we are keeping alive our connection to history, which really our whole society shares in, but we as Christians especially have motivation to do that. And as she's kind of making that argument, I'm thinking, Jesus begins his gospel message with the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God's at hand. And the word he uses for time is the Greek word kairos, which means a critical moment in time. And it assumes that the chronos, that's the other Greek word for time, which is like the kind of time you keep on a watch. It assumes that the chronos, the years and the centuries have all been building up to this kairos, this critical moment in time. And so Jesus sees himself as connected to a story of what God is doing and has been doing in the world. And the kingdom of God is the culmination of why God created the world. And as Christians, we know that. And because we know that, we should be connected to the past and the story that's come before us.
She's observing and commenting on this ahistoric age as she identifies and defines it, and marks, as we said, 2010 as the year that we can really see these characteristics come to the forefront in Western society. And she also observes that the church is not immune to the effects of this ahistoric age. In fact, she's contesting that as Christians, we should have this distinct approach to and understanding of the past, a way that we cultivate it and preserve it, both cultivate and preserve it, that you were just describing a moment ago. And she also points out that where ahistoricism is present, so in Western society, in the church, that it tends to manifest itself in these three attitudes towards the past. We might tend to think of history as irrelevant. And you explained a moment ago, we tend to think of the good life as one of self-invention, where we're free to self-create. Or it might manifest itself as ignorance. We just don't know that much about the past, including the origin of ideas, even ideas we value. So things we might rest our belief systems on, often she's pointing out we don't know where those come from, those ideas come from. Or it might show up as an ideological understanding of the past. And you mentioned this a moment ago, too, that we see the past as oppressive. And our attitude is one that says there are a lot of oppressive events and people in the past, and we need to free ourselves from those. So she points out that it's rare right now to see humble, civilized disagreement or discussion about ideas, especially those that really have their roots in history. And so we might not know where those ideas come from, and then we don't dialogue well about them. And she's pointing out, too, that because we have this ideological lens, we often just see historical events through that lens, and then they serve to bolster just one perspective or the other. And so there we reduce them and take away the nuance in those historical people or events and can only see them or understand them in one way. And so she's saying we need to be cautious about this as Christians. These attitudes towards the past can be present in our church communities as well. And often they are. And so today in our discussion, in part 3 of the book, she is making her positive case for why we should tend and keep the past, why we should make an effort to know it, and how actually we can integrate historical perspectives and practices into our lives in a way that enriches them now.
She has 4 chapters in this section, and each one of them is one way that history enriches us or helps us. And as I was thinking through these, each of them is a way that knowing and being connected to history helps mitigate against a tendency or a blind spot created in us by modernity. And I think that's why she chose the 4 things to highlight that she chose.
The first point that she makes is stewarding our time. And what does she mean by that? It's an interesting, just the title itself strikes me as interesting. And this, how can history help us? My first thought is not that it will help me make better use of or use my time well.
It's a time management tool. Just learn history.
Study
So
history.
your time management and your efficiency will be best. Well, she notes how Christians of the past would mark the days, liturgically, or they would mark the days with prayer. She notices how they would mark the seasons. And marking the days and marking the seasons is a critical practice that keeps us connected to the fact that the days and the seasons are first of all, not just determined by us. So you think about a season. A season is actually something you don't have any control over in some ways. You just live in it and you adapt to it and you learn how to thrive in it. Winter is my least favorite season of the year, but I always have this moment. Usually it's about mid-December when it's getting to be the darkest and the coldest, where I have some rhythms of that season that start to make it life-giving for me. It's not just what we call the holiday stuff. It's things like getting home at 4:30 when it's dark and jumping on my bike trainer, and I always pick something I'm going to read on the bike trainer, and making soup. These things are they actually help me embrace that season. And so she notices that Christians in the past did a much better job of ordering their life around the changing seasons and the days. And this is a way that they acknowledge that, first of all, time is a gift from God, that we're not totally in control of our lives, that much of what we do has to be in response to what God has done and how He's ordered things, and that we are connected to the people who came after us, and we'll hand this off to the people who come after us. She gets into specific things in this chapter about how they marked time, but it did help me think about how I can tend to waste time because I don't mark and have habits of marking and remembering that this time is given to me by God for His glory.
I love the 2 contexts that you're setting up there. That the one is that our time is given to us by God to use and steward, and that He is the one who has set the seasons in place, and the one who ordered the world. And so the way that we experience time is His idea, God's creative idea to begin with. And actually, Scripture tells us that stewarding our time is part of what we are to do as Christians. And then the other context, the historical context that you mentioned and that she's bringing out, gave Christians an actual way to structure their days. And that is something that I do think we're lacking. We just sort of go along with the status quo often. And you said you realize sometimes that means that you just waste time, sort of fritter away time, because it seems like this use of time is something that is beyond our control, when actually some of these practices that she reminds us about in this chapter give structure to our days. One of the things she mentions specifically is regular rhythms of prayer or set times of prayer throughout the day. And you and I have talked a little bit about this, but not to the degree that she's bringing it out in this chapter. We often do these episodes we call Daily Life with God, or we talk about the importance of having a set time to spend with God each day. And this is another step beyond that. It's beyond this 30 or 45 minutes that you set aside probably at the beginning of your day. And it's pointing us back to the historical practice of an entire community of people assuming that certain parts of their day were dedicated for this purpose. So they would pause wherever they were, whatever they were doing, and take time to pray.
That's right. I have a habit of marking the beginning of my day by spending time with God. I don't have that habit at the end of the day. She made the point in here that Christians who use the Book of Common Prayer, and I would expect an Anglican like Sarah Irving Stonebreaker to introduce the Book of Common Prayer, but she makes the point that Christians who use the Book of Common Prayer, whole societies would be ordered around it, they would mark not just the beginning of the day, like I do with my quiet time, but also the end of the day with God. And as I was reading that, I thought, I really need to do that because I tend to be good at marking the beginning of the day as from the Lord. I tend to be less good at marking the end of the day. And sometimes my day just kind of peters out because I get tired or I've wasted too much time doing something. And I'm like, oh shoot, it's time to go to bed. You know,
you have the shoot end of day liturgy.
I have the shoot. It's time to. My evening ritual right now is load the dishwasher, wipe down the counter, get myself in bed. Now, what if I had prayer? That would be great. Last night, right before bed, I was doing my learning my French lessons on the Babbel app, and I learned how to order olives and peanuts in a bar. Je fais des olives et des cacahuètes. And what if I had prayed instead?
Yeah,
would have been better.
It would have been better.
Yeah.
Well, you maybe would not have gotten to share that phrase with us today,
right.
But yeah, this is an interesting one to me, this thought of structuring our days and intentionally setting aside times for prayer. There are 3 levels that she encourages us to think about this on. One is personal. That's what we were just talking about. One is familial. So what rhythms do you have as a family that shape and give structure to your days? And how are those orienting you towards God? And third is communal. So she encourages us to ask, who is in your Christian community? And are there ways, times during the week, that you share with others that structure your week? So a real-time example here might be if you're part of a fellowship group, then she's saying, actually set aside that time, dedicate that time. Don't let it just slip to the demands of life, but prioritize that. And that's one of the things that will give structure to your week and help orient you to God and his people.
Well, in chapter 2, she talks about recovering sacredness and beauty. And she spends a lot of time, or actually this is chapter 10, but it's the second chapter in this section. But she spends a lot of time talking about physical space here, which is I was not expecting from the title of the chapter. And she talks about being oriented to the beauty of physical space, and she cites like historic church buildings that were meant to orient you vertically into the beauty of God and to his world. And she talks about the sacredness of space. And she even gives examples of like people who would literally have prayer closets in their home, like a little small room that was set aside for prayer, and that's all you did in that space is you prayed. You didn't do anything else in that closet. You didn't hang up your clothes or shine your shoes or throw away your dirty laundry. You just prayed.
I think someone reading through these 2 sections, the stewarding our time section, in which she mentions historic practices. So you talked about the Book of Common Prayer. She mentions also other resources, other historical resources or historic practices. And then in this section, recovering sacredness and beauty, she gives that illustration of the architecture of churches from ages past. And we can see how that architecture was meant to draw our attention to God. In these examples, I wonder if someone might just read through them and think, oh, is this what it means to be a priest of history? That I need to use the Book of Common Prayer, and that I should find a church to attend that is in a historic building, because the sense might be like to actually tend and keep history, what she's contesting we should do. Then if you're lacking these tools or realities in your life, then you are somehow ahistoric or having a lesser experience.
I think some people who have grown up in like really low church environments that don't have a lot of knowledge of history, they definitely will swing in that direction, or go toward a more liturgical or historically grounded or rooted or expressive tradition out of this desire. That's not a bad thing. I don't think everyone has to do that. I also appreciate the fact that the gospel goes into cultures, and when it goes into a culture, it is free from having to put on all the clothes of the sending culture or previous cultures. And so this is even one of the reasons, like, I'm actually convictionally committed to more contemporary expressions of church. Is I want to bring the gospel into the particular culture in which I live and let it take on an expression that wears the clothes of this culture. I think that's really important for helping a lot of people have access to the gospel. But now, if you're in my shoes, I don't want to do that in a way that is detached from history. So I want us, I'll tell people all the time, we're all in for unoriginality at Fellowship Denver. We're not trying to make anything up. In fact, we rely on the theological traditions that have come before us. We use, for example, hymns, traditional hymns in our worship, not exclusively, but we use them. We celebrate the Lord's Supper, which is actually what connects Christians of all traditions throughout history. It's very important to me that we celebrate the Lord's Supper. This is a way of not only doing what Jesus taught us to do, that's the most important reason to do it, but it's also a connection to the global and historic church. I mean, Christians all over the world, whatever their worship looks like, they celebrate the Lord's Supper. And Christians throughout history, whether they have soaring cathedral-like ceilings with stained glass, or whether they have more contemporary-looking spaces, they celebrate the Lord's Supper. And so I think doing these kinds of grounded practices keep us even in a more modern culture expression of Christianity, rooted in the past and not unhitched from what's gone before us.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think she's actually saying, although you could read it like that at face value, I think what she's cautioning against is actually an attitude in worship or in our current practice that is dismissive of the past or ignorant of it. If that is our attitude, that those who came before us, probably that we've evolved past that, or that we attach a rightness to a contemporary style of worship, then I think we're being dismissive of the past in a way that could actually make our worship in the present impoverished. An understanding of the past in the way you're describing it really enriches our connection as Christians to the historical community that she's talking about, an understanding that in those things like baptism and the Lord's Supper, the ordinances, that we are connected to Christians throughout history and to Christians whose expressions in different cultures have looked different, and yet they have maintained those ordinances historically and currently.
She also makes the point in here that some Christians in different eras of history or before kind of the ahistoric era that she's talking about were more attuned to the correlation between Christian truth and beauty. She cites her own conversion here when she talks about she was getting restless with her atheistic beliefs, and part of her restlessness was they weren't beautiful or satisfying to her. And she found C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, and part of what struck her as she read Mere Christianity was the aesthetic beauty and coherence of the Christian faith. Because it has an internal logic, and because it's connected to the creation, it is inherently beautiful, and that drew her to the Christian faith.
As an illustration of the way that tending and keeping the past can help us preserve that aspect of Christianity, our connection to an appreciation of beauty, and seeing it as actually part of what we were created for and part of what we were created to make along with God. She uses illustrations of classical composers who were distinctly Christian and other Christian poets and authors, and she describes their work as part of a long, big, beautiful story. And that when we engage their work, we can participate in and appreciate that long story. And I think current artists, Christian artists, and authors do the same. They're contributing to that story. And so she's saying, as you engage that and make efforts to listen to and read these historical works of music, of art, of literature, that it gives you a deeper appreciation for God's world and for the connection to sacredness and beauty. All right, the third section in this part 3, so the next chapter after chapter 2/10
which is chapter 11.
Which is chapter 11, is about history and intellectual formation.
To summarize her point here, I thought I would just read the opening of this chapter, also because it references one of my favorite books. If you open a modern edition of John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion and turn to the end, you will discover a list of the authors and texts Calvin cites. One of my favorite exercises I get my students to do before showing them that list is to guess how many authors Calvin refers to in the Institutes. I point them in the right direction by reminding them that Calvin was in dialogue not just with church fathers like Jerome and Athanasius, but also with classical authors. The Institute cites 8 texts by Plato, 4 by Plutarch, for example. When my students count the number of authors and discover there are no fewer than 70, they are struck with fascination and curiosity. Why is Calvin constantly referring to all these old authors, they ask. Some are genuinely surprised that Calvin referred to any text or authors at all outside of the Bible. Now, what she's showing us there is Calvin was doing his theology in conversation, not just with Christians who had come before him, but also with the best of classical thought and philosophy that had come before him. And when you, therefore, or maybe this is me drawing this point from her, when you therefore read Calvin, you are learning how to think that way as well, and you're getting the benefit of that kind of thought, which you just don't get that in any modern book. I think on the last episode I said I often find that pre-modern authors will describe something differently, more beautifully, more truthfully than I will often, or more richly than I find like modern Christian authors describing it. And part of that is for the reason she just cited. They're in conversation with a much richer field of literature and thought. And so if when you see that, you're like, man, we are not in conversation with that thought as much anymore. So how can we fix that? Well, the answer is read the ones who were.
Another point that she makes in this section about history and intellectual formation is the perspective that modern educational institutions often take about education itself. And so she points out that a historic view of education, which existed for centuries, was that education served the purpose of forming individuals to be civic participants and forming them in virtue according to the values of the society. that the institution was in at large. And she points out how that has now shifted. The expression of most educational institutions is that they are enabling people to identify who they are and to become that best version of themselves. So she includes a quote that is from an institution that she's pointing out as an example of this. It says, "It's about what's inside you, not where you've come from. Your future success starts here." And so this is one of the ways that this attitude towards history is displaying itself. And she's pointing out that that shift in our educational institutions actually has big ramifications when you think about the number of young people who are going through them and being submitted to a distinctly different sort of educational philosophy. So she's contesting that this historical perspective on education is actually more fruitful in the lives of students. It actually does form and shape people in a certain way.
Well, I took from this that we should all just be reading more John Calvin. For that reason, I have a friend who comes from a low church Baptist kind of tradition, and her and her family have recently joined a Presbyterian church. And so I was talking to them this week, and they're learning about Presbyterianism and trying to figure out kind of how they fit in this new church they joined. And I was like, the best thing you can do if you want to be a good Presbyterian is just read John Calvin. And my friend is, she loves Russian literature. So I was like, it's actually, Calvin is really easy to read in the English translations. He's really easy to read. He's much easier to read and follow than Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Yeah, those guys are complicated. Calvin is clear and to the point. So it's like, just read him.
She points out that the authors that you're mentioning, not the Russian authors that you just mentioned, but the classic authors, including John Calvin, Isaac Watts, John Milton, and she points out that this exists in classic literature in its various forms. So in poetry, in novels, in nonfiction work, that the authors in those previous eras were often asking big questions like, what does it mean to be human? How can we know anything? What is the purpose of suffering? What's the nature of beauty? How can we live a just and moral life? And that they borrow from each other in the way that you just described with John Calvin. And so in doing so, that when we engage them, we actually, our understanding of those big questions that they were asking then helps us ask and answer them as well in a way that is rooted in a historical understanding in a well-rounded way, because they relied on the various sorts of work from each other and from people who predated them.
Calvin is like C.S. Lewis in the sense that he wrote so clearly that you can follow exactly what he's saying, and yet he also drew from such deep wells that you probably are seeing only a small fraction of what he's actually doing. When a teacher explained C.S. Lewis to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, C.S. Lewis was doing a lot more than I thought when I read him. And Calvin's the same way. I'll read Calvin, I'll see all these references to these classical authors that she just pointed us to, and I'm like, I have no idea what he's doing with that, but it's cool that he's doing it.
But I think it's really good. My sense is it's really good.
But the result is fantastic.
The last chapter in this section talks about history and spiritual formation. How does an understanding of history and this practice of tending and keeping the past deepen or encourage spiritual formation?
Throughout this book, she does a good job of giving little vignettes of Christians from the past that she's learned from. It's obvious that she's studied them and appreciates something about them. And in this section, she's giving vignettes of their spiritual practices, of their practices of knowing God and relating to God. And while these are not prescribed for us in Scripture, we can learn from their wisdom and incorporate them into our lives. She has a lengthy section, for example, on meditation. And I actually got introduced to this guy through her book. She writes about Joseph Hall. Joseph Hall was a bishop in the Church of England, and he wrote books about what he called Protestant meditation. She says Hall fervently believed that meditation could help all Christians in their spiritual formation. This Protestant tradition has largely been forgotten or neglected in the ahistoric age, yet it holds riches for us. And she means meditating on Scripture itself. And she goes on to give a great summary of how he did that, and how he didn't coach people, because you didn't coach anything when you were back in that age, but how he taught people to do it. So I found that fascinating. She's just pointing out we can watch and observe the spiritual disciplines, we might say, or the prayer habits or the meditation habits of people who've gone before us, and we might learn something that's been largely neglected in the ahistoric age.
I think part of what she's contesting in this last chapter, it's pretty brief, but she does include that section on meditation, which is encouraging and I found really interesting. And she is making the point that doing the things, engaging in some of the practices that she encouraged in the previous 3 chapters in this part 3 of the book, so stewarding our time, structuring our days, recovering sacredness and beauty, engaging with art, literature, and poetry from the past, but with this openness to beauty and looking for the sacred, the perspectives of sacredness that were present within them that are largely lost in modern literature. And then seeing these historical practices and engaging the past as a part of intellectual formation, and especially Christian intellectual formation, that all of those things are part of our spiritual formation. And so she re-emphasizes in this last section the need to structure our days, to engage with thinkers, writers, and artists from the past, and then also includes this section on meditation and says that our spiritual lives and our spiritual formation will be enriched and our understanding of God is greater when we do those things, when we spend intentional time in prayer, when we structure our days to orient our minds and our hearts towards Him, and when we engage with historic figures and authors.
Well, Autumn, I'm really glad that I brought this book to your attention, and I'm really glad that you digested it so thoroughly that you could help us learn so much from it. So this has been a fun conversation, and I have this like hobby horse that I sometimes get on that I'm like, everyone should learn from a historic theological tradition and commit to it for life. And it should be the Reformed tradition or the Protestant, tradition. And she's modeling that really well here for us and showing us how she's done that. So I just want to say, preach, Sarah Irving Stonebreaker.
This is a really accessible book. I enjoyed it, and I'd encourage those of you listening to pick it up, give it a read. We'd love to hear what you think about it. And we're going to follow these couple of episodes with some discussions, a few more discussions about church history and various eras of church history. That topic is huge, so we'll just scratch the surface of it. But we do hope that both these couple of episodes and those to follow this one about church history whet your appetite, and that you are encouraged to do what you just said, Hunter, to learn specifically about a theological tradition, but also to engage some of these really interesting and informative and helpful, beautiful authors and writers from the past. And this book, Priests of History, will introduce you to some of them. And that might be a good springboard to continue reading, thinking about the topic. So thanks for joining me today, H. To those of you listening, we hope you enjoyed these episodes. We love hearing from you. So if you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.